The novel begins in the late 1950s with the protagonist, a woman whose name remains undisclosed as we are to learn it in the third part of the story, narrating her marital life after 15 years of marriage. This narrative takes us back 15 years earlier, specifically to the early 1940s. The story begins at her sister's house, where she meets a young lawyer named Ahmed, a friend of her brother-in-law, who was just starting his career. From their very first encounter, there was mutual admiration. Ahmed openly expressed his interest in her, but she didn't believe in love at first sight. Instead, she decided to put this budding affection to the test over time, allowing herself to get to know him better. For 6 months, she subjected their relationship to this trial phase, which proved sufficient for her to decide that she truly loved him, and he loved her in return. She became determined that she would marry no one but him. However, there was a significant problem. Ahmed had no intention of marrying. She began analyzing his personality to uncover the reasons behind his reluctance toward marriage. Her observations led her to identify 3 key traits. Arrogance. Ahmed was self-assured, wanting to feel superior to the idea of marriage. He seemed to revel in the notion that women liked him for who he was, not because of any desire to settle down. Instability. His life was scattered and inconsistent. At the beginning of the month, he was in one state, and by the end of the month, he was in another. Sometimes he stayed at his parents' house, while at other times, he lived in a boarding house. Aversion to responsibility. As a trainee lawyer working on small insurance company cases, Ahmed lived solely for himself. He would sacrifice work without hesitation if a pleasant evening came his way, spending all his money on entertainment. He only became motivated to work when his pockets were empty. After analyzing these traits, she began addressing them one by one. The plan to change. Ahmed taming his arrogance. She worked on satisfying his ego by always presenting herself in the most beautiful way possible. She ensured she was the most attractive woman in any gathering where Ahmed was present. She fed his emotions with a mix of contrasting feelings, at times appearing weak and tearful in front of him, at other times acting strong and unattainable like the walls of Acre. Sometimes she made him jealous, while at other times she filled him with confidence to the point of arrogance. She used every possible human emotion, channeling it toward him, to occupy every corner of his feelings. Addressing his instability. She tied him to her through the telephone. Wherever he went, he had to call her, informing her of his whereabouts. This habit became so ingrained that he eventually adjusted to her regular calls, which inadvertently led him to organize his time and life more effectively. Over time, he settled into a routine, fostering a sense of responsibility. Once he achieved a semblance of stability, he began to feel a sense of accountability toward his work. She then shifted some of her responsibilities onto him. She started asking for his permission before going out, even with her family. She sought his approval for her friends, her clothes, and the places she visited. If he disapproved, she would comply without argument. Gradually, this nurtured in him a subconscious sense of responsibility for her. Through this carefully calculated approach, she transformed his attitudes, paving the way for a deeper, more stable bond between them. Of course, no one knew about her love story except her sister. However, when her sister's husband found out, he became furious and upset, expressing his displeasure toward Ahmed's presence. She seized this opportunity and fueled Ahmed's feelings of alienation, pushing him toward making the long-awaited decision. Finally, Ahmed confessed his desire to marry her. Her heart danced with joy, but her happiness was soon met with countless obstacles. Ahmed's financial situation was dire. He had no stable job with a steady income, no family inheritance to fall back on, and his status was far below that of her sister's husband's. Despite this, she was determined to marry him, regardless of his circumstances. When she broached the subject with her family, her parents outright rejected Ahmed as a suitor because of his poverty. For the first time in her life, she rebelled against her parents' authority. She rejected their disapproval and stood firm in her decision to marry Ahmed. Her father stopped speaking to her, and her mother cried endlessly, lamenting her daughter's misfortune. Meanwhile, she locked herself in her room, refusing to eat. One day she threatened to take her own life, another day she vowed to run away from home, and on a third day she pretended to be ill. In the end, her persistence wore down her father's resistance. His heart softened, and he reluctantly agreed to her marriage with Ahmed. Soon after, their engagement was officially announced. After the engagement, the traditional wedding challenges began, the first being the dowry. Ahmed had only 100 Egyptian pounds, a modest sum compared to the dowries her sisters had received. Ahmed suggested borrowing 200 pounds to raise the total to 300, but she adamantly refused. She believed that any borrowed amount would burden them with repayments and sour the beginning of their married life. She convinced her family to accept the 100 pounds as it was. Then came the issue of the wedding jewellery. The most Ahmed could afford was a bracelet worth 60 pounds, while her mother gifted her a solitaire ring. The bigger challenge came next, finding an apartment and furnishing it. Her eldest sister lived in a villa in Heliopolis, and her second sister resided in a luxurious apartment in Zamalek. It was expected that her home would be of a similar standard. Her mother and sisters began searching for a suitable apartment that matched their status, but she had a different approach. She calculated Ahmed's income against the rent of a fancy apartment. With Ahmed earning only £25 a month, he could not afford rent above £4. Hiring a cook, a waiter, or a maid, like in her family home, was also out of the question. She would have to do all the housework herself. With this logic, she settled on a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood that she could manage both financially and physically. After some searching, Ahmed found a small apartment consisting of a room, a small living area, a kitchen, and a bathroom, with a monthly rent of £3. Its proximity to Ahmed's workplace saved them transportation costs as well. She agreed to the apartment and was delighted with it after ensuring it was clean and located in a good neighborhood. Her mother, however, broke down in tears, lamenting that her daughter would live in what she called a chicken coop. Her father resumed his cold silence, and her sisters refused to accept the idea of her living in such a small space. But she insisted on it, as it was the only apartment that matched her husband's circumstances. Eventually, her father relented and decided to allocate her £20 monthly to ease the hardships she would face. She declined to take the money outright, but didn't reject it completely. Instead, she asked her father to deposit it into a bank account in her name every month. She planned to rely on it only in times of dire need, as she was determined to live within her husband's means. Next came the furnishing of the apartment. She had it repainted and selected furniture that suited its small size. She coordinated with her sisters and friends regarding wedding gifts, asking them to give her practical items for her new home. She spent frugally on furniture, saving most of the money for her personal items, such as dresses, nightgowns, and perfumes. Her reasoning was clear. Her husband was marrying her, not the apartment. Finally, the wedding took place in a small tea party attended by close family and friends. There was no singer, dancer, or the extravagant festivities typically associated with weddings. The entire event cost no more than £30. At last, she was escorted to her marital home, ready to begin her life with Ahmed. In the beginning of her married life, she was aware that all her family members were betting on the failure of her marriage, so she was determined to succeed at any cost and with all the effort. From the start, she decided never to complain to anyone except her husband, and not to allow anyone to interfere in their disagreements, no matter how complicated, not even her father or mother. The honeymoon phase passed like sweet honey, and after that she began facing the challenges of married life. The first issue was cooking. She wasn't a skilled cook and had never even stepped into the kitchen before marriage. Like many women of her time, she relied on a cookbook by Abla Nazira. However, she found all the recipes too complicated and expensive, while her daily food budget was only 20 piastres. After some thought, she came up with an old theory. It's not about the type of food, but how you present it. So she put all her focus on setting the table itself, like in a fine restaurant. She arranged the plates, forks, knives and spoons with care, always using a brightly colored, neatly ironed tablecloth, folded napkins cleaned meticulously, and a flower picked from the street trees placed at the center of the table. She would only greet her husband at lunchtime in a full outing dress, while the food itself was usually sardines or eggs, along with, of course, beans and falafel. The presentation of the table and her appearance were enough to make up for the simplicity of the dishes. She continued like this until she began to master cooking bit by bit, though she still limited herself to only a few dishes. She would prepare only 2 items per meal to save money. 4 days a week would be meat or chicken with either rice or pasta. Nothing more than 2 items. If she made soup, she would skip the rice or pasta. On the remaining 3 days, it would return to beans, falafel, eggs, and sardines. In the beginning, all the finances were managed by Ahmed, who would give her £1 for the household expenses for 2 days. She would save on her shopping, making sure the pound lasted for 3 days, leaving her with some extra. Over time, Ahmed began trusting her judgment with money, gradually letting her handle the finances until, by the beginning of every month, he would give her all his earnings and she would then give him his daily allowance. Of course, she was the one managing all the housework, washing, cleaning, sweeping, cooking, and even going to the market to buy the household necessities. She never shied away from any task at home, but she did all these things when her husband wasn't around, because she liked to devote her time to him whenever he was at home. She always wanted him to see her soft and elegant, at her most feminine, not looking worn out from washing and cleaning. As the days went by, Ahmed started to change. He became nervous and irritable, even over trivial matters. His work schedule became chaotic. She didn't get angry or upset, but as usual, she began searching for the reasons behind his irritability. She soon discovered that Ahmed was still in the early stages of building his career. His income was low, and now it had to be divided between the two of them after their marriage. All of this created a sense of inadequacy within him, even in front of her. This feeling suddenly led him to ask her, without any reason, not to spend a single penny of her money or her father's money on the house, as he was the only one responsible for her and the house. She nodded in agreement and said, "Okay," absorbing his anger with a soft smile. She followed his instructions and lived on the £25 of his income. However, Ahmed remained the same, so she began to analyze him, as usual. She concluded that she needed to create a fight with him, something that would provoke him into exploding, so he would open up and share everything he was feeling. So, she started singing in a way she knew he disliked. Then he asked her to be quiet. When she didn't stop, she began tapping on the dining table in an annoying manner, expecting him to snap, yell at her, or even hit her, and then he would finally release all his feelings. But he did something worse than she expected. He grabbed the vase, the most expensive piece of furniture in the house, and broke it. She collapsed in tears, and he immediately felt guilty, hugged her, apologized, and finally vented all the frustrations in his chest. He revealed the cause of his mood, his work, and the feeling that he wasn't earning what he deserved, and how he felt incapable of providing the life she had in her father's home. She was relieved and happy that Ahmed had shared his feelings. She forgot all about the vase. To hell with the vase. As long as Ahmed's peace of mind was restored, the days passed, and their life began to settle. One night, after Ahmed returned from a night out with some friends, she had agreed to let him go out without her 2 nights a week, so he wouldn't feel suffocated by her presence. He came back that night, kissed her, told her what happened during his night out, and went to sleep. The next morning, while she was folding his clothes to wash them, she came across a handkerchief. Her eyes froze on the handkerchief, and the world spun around her as she stood in place, almost collapsing to the floor, if not for the wall she leaned against. She saw a large stain of lipstick on the handkerchief and smelled a woman's perfume wafting from it. The lipstick wasn't hers and the perfume wasn't hers either.